The first time my stepbrother publicly called me the emotional liability of the family, it happened during the annual board dinner of Whitmore Capital. Crystal glasses clinked softly around the long marble table while investors from London and New York discussed expansion strategies, and my stepbrother Daniel stood at the head of the room delivering what he believed was a clever joke. "My father always believed in giving everyone a chance," he said with a smile that looked rehearsed. "Even my sister Eliza, though numbers were never really her strength." A few people laughed politely. Some looked uncomfortable. I kept my expression neutral and slowly set my glass of water down on the table. Because what Daniel didn't know, what none of them knew yet, was that the numbers he was presenting as Whitmore Capital's future were actually the reason his control over the company would quietly disappear before the end of the week. 5 years earlier, the story inside the Whitmore family had been very different. When my father built Whitmore Capital, he built it with the patience of someone who understood that power rarely comes from noise. He taught me financial analysis when I was 16, long before Daniel entered the family through my stepmother's marriage. But Daniel learned something different from my father. He learned visibility. Investors liked confident people, and Daniel knew exactly how to present himself as one. When my father passed away unexpectedly 3 years later, the board believed the most visible person in the room must also be the most capable. Daniel became CEO before the funeral flowers had even wilted. At first I stayed. I worked quietly inside the analytics division of the company my father had spent his entire life building. I assumed the numbers would eventually reveal the truth. Because Daniel's leadership style wasn't strategic, it was theatrical. He made bold expansion announcements, signed risky acquisition deals, and appeared constantly on financial podcasts describing his vision for the company's future. Investors applauded his confidence, but behind the scenes I watched something else develop. Every quarter the company's debt ratio crept upward. Every acquisition came with financing structures that looked impressive in press releases but fragile inside the balance sheet. I tried warning him during one private meeting. Daniel leaned back in his leather chair and listened to my concerns for exactly 30 seconds before smiling politely. "Eliza," he said calmly, "you've always been good with spreadsheets, but leadership requires instinct. Investors follow confidence." Then he dismissed me from the office like an intern who had wandered too far into executive territory. 2 months later he removed me from the analytics division entirely. Officially, the restructuring was described as organizational efficiency. Unofficially, it was Daniel making sure no one inside the company continued questioning the numbers behind his decisions. My final day at Whitmore Capital passed quietly. No dramatic confrontation. No speeches. I packed my files into a small box and walked out of the same glass doors my father once walked through every morning for 20 years. Daniel believed he had removed the problem from his company. What he had actually done was remove the only person still protecting it. For the first year after leaving Whitmore Capital, I didn't start another company. I didn't launch a rival investment firm. Instead, I studied. I analyzed every public filing Whitmore released. I tracked every acquisition Daniel made and every loan structure attached to it. Patterns began appearing that no one else seemed to notice. Daniel wasn't just expanding the company, he was leveraging it aggressively against projected future revenue. That strategy works beautifully while the economy stays predictable. But markets don't stay predictable forever. By the second year, I quietly launched something called Astron Analytics. Unlike traditional investment firms, Astron didn't manage assets publicly. It built predictive risk models for private investors. Algorithms designed to identify companies whose leadership decisions were slowly pushing them towards structural collapse. Hedge funds in London and Boston began using our forecasts to protect their investments. And the more data our systems analyzed, the clearer Whitmore Capital's trajectory became. Daniel believed he was building an empire. The models showed something very different. The opportunity to move came when Whitmore Capital announced its largest acquisition yet. a massive renewable infrastructure project funded almost entirely through debt-backed financing. Investors celebrated the announcement across financial media. Daniel appeared on television describing it as the deal that secures Whitmore's dominance for the next decade. But buried inside the financing documents was a small clause almost no one paid attention to. A clause allowing debt holders to call an emergency restructuring vote if projected earnings failed to meet a specific threshold. That threshold was mathematically impossible to reach. Over the next 9 months, Astron Analytics began quietly acquiring Whitmore's debt through layered investment vehicles. Not enough to trigger suspicion. Just enough to accumulate influence. Financial journalists continued praising Daniel's bold strategy while the structure beneath his empire slowly shifted. By the time the annual investor conference arrived in London, Astron-controlled entities held just under 40% of Whitmore's outstanding debt obligations. Daniel still had no idea. The conference ballroom inside the Langford Hotel looked exactly like the kind of room designed to celebrate success. Tall windows overlooking the Thames, polished brass lighting reflecting off glass tables, and a stage where Daniel stood confidently explaining why Whitmore Capital was entering its most powerful era yet. His presentation lasted 40 minutes and ended with the kind of applause executives expect when their audience still believes the story they're selling. Then the final slide appeared. Projected revenue forecasts suddenly shifted to a different dataset, one produced by Astron's predictive models. Instead of exponential growth, the graph behind Daniel showed Whitmore Capital approaching a financial liquidity crisis within 18 months. Confused murmurs spread through the audience. Daniel turned toward the technical staff near the stage. "That projection isn't ours," he said sharply. "That's because it's mine." My voice came from the center aisle as I stood slowly and walked toward the stage. Dozens of investors turned in their seats, recognizing my name as whispers moved through the room. "Eliza Whitmore?" someone murmured. I stepped beside Daniel and connected a small tablet to the presentation system. The next slide appeared instantly. Ownership structures. Investment entities. Debt acquisition reports. Every path leading back to Astron Analytics. The room went silent as the numbers settled in. "You removed me from the company 2 years ago," I said calmly, looking directly at Daniel. "But you forgot something important. Companies aren't controlled by titles. They're controlled by leverage." Phones lit up across the ballroom as investors searched Astron's portfolio data. The final slide appeared. Emergency restructuring vote scheduled for the following morning. Majority debt holders recommending leadership replacement. Proposed CEO, Eliza Whitmore. Daniel stared at the screen like someone watching gravity stop working. "This is impossible," he said quietly. I looked at him with the same calm expression he once used when dismissing my warnings. "No," I replied softly. "This is mathematics." The vote the next morning lasted less than 10 minutes. Investors rarely protect leadership that threatens their profits. When the results appeared on the boardroom screen, Whitmore Capital officially had a new CEO. Later that afternoon, Daniel entered the office that once belonged to our father. The same office he had occupied for 3 years, believing it proved his superiority. He sat down across from my desk without speaking for several seconds. "What happens now?" he finally asked. I slid a thin folder across the table. Inside was a new contract. Director of Strategic Risk Analysis. Daniel looked at the title for a long moment. "You're demoting me," he said. I leaned back slightly in my chair. "No," I replied. "I'm giving you the position that matches your actual strengths." As he left the office quietly, I turned toward the window overlooking London's skyline. Whitmore Capital was finally stable again. The company my father built had survived not because of confidence or speeches, but because someone had been willing to understand the numbers behind the story. And the most satisfying part wasn't the power I had gained. It was the lesson Daniel had finally learned. Because in business, just like in life, the loudest person in the room rarely controls the outcome. The person who understands the system does.